that have been impacted by it. We're going to focus on small and large-scale solutions after that, so things we as UCSD students and the general public can do, and then large-scale solutions to take it globally. And then we're going to end it on some resources to have an action plan moving forward.
So we wanted to start this off with a quote that really demonstrates what colonization of the mind really is. This quote is by Malcolm X, who was a Muslim American activist and part of the Nation of Islam, which was a black nationalist movement during the civil rights movement to combat racial inequality and discrimination. The media often painted Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, and the black community in a negative light to incite hate against them, while also glorifying the white race. And so basically that's what this quote explains. It says, "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing." This is also happening in Palestine right now, and we can see that even through the media and UCSD. I don't know if you guys saw this, but the Israeli club was going around posting these flyers, and they would have Israeli citizens on them, and it would say, "Raped by Hamas," but obviously these allegations had no evidence, and the media was doing this as well, and this was to incite hate against Palestine by painting a certain narrative. And the media even used October 7th as an excuse to incite hate against Palestine. But if you really take a step back and look at why this happened, it was in response to 75 years of oppression by the oppressor. So this just shows like how the oppressor was seen as the oppressed and the oppressed as the oppressor.
Okay, so first, I want to differentiate between decolonization and decolonization of the mind, because they sound very similar, but they are different things. So decolonization just refers to a country or colony that was being oppressed finally gaining independence from its oppressor, but decolonization of the mind instead refers to the lasting effects of that colonization on individuals and how that affects the way we think about our own culture. So what does decolonization of the mind mean then? So it means that understanding that colonization has socialized us, and that taking steps to figure out what we think about our culture without this colonial way of thinking. It also means pulling apart and critically examining the norms that have been presented to us through, through colonization. And I just want to end this by saying that, like, who is to blame for us having this decolonization of the mind? And I don't think that, of course, it's not the individual's fault, because you've been fed this system, you've been told these lies, so of course you believe it. But once you learn that this is happening, it is your responsibility to start decolonizing your mind and like educating yourself, because if you don't, then you're just participating in this system that perpetuates Western-centric worldviews, and that's ultimately harmful to everyone.
This is a little infographic that's like an overview of what colonization of the mind really looks like. So this photo just reveals how different factors influence our daily perceptions and views. And this really makes you question, like, to what extent do we really think for ourselves and come up with our own views if we're not consciously thinking about what we're taking in. So we can see how these different factors, such as our upbringing, the regions we grew up in, social norms, government systems and structures, these all influence the way we think.
Exactly. So why exactly do we need to decolonize our minds? There are a variety of reasons, but first off, it's doing irreversible damage to our environment. For instance, in oceanic politics, the way the West thinks about the ocean is not the way regions in Oceania do. For indigenous cultures there, in the Marshall Islands too, the water is something sacred, it's something to be shared by everyone, it's not something you can just divide between countries and deny people access to. The West has a very different attitude towards that. I believe during World War II, we just took over the Marshall Islands, and decided to just nuclear test our weapons there. And that did lead to some damage there. The inhabitants are still dealing with the radiation impacts to this day. And indigenous communities worldwide are losing their connections to the land. And then another reason is that it prevents history from repeating itself. If we know more about how this ended up happening, what empire led where, how this cycle of violence kept on repeating, empires rise and empires fall, that's a given in all of history. But if we notice the patterns and what comes after, usually after an empire falls, there's a power vacuum, and then a regime takes over. That's a common theme seen in the global south. A lot of them have been colonized by Western European powers, and then that power vacuum and economic stability left after led to someone taking power and using it for unjust reasons. And it also affects the way we perceive complex emergencies. For instance, what's going on in Israel and Palestine. If you didn't know any better and learning about this through the media was your only exposure to this topic, then you would assume, oh, okay, I think I know what's happening. Israel is just fighting a terrorist and they're defending their land. But you would, if you delve deeper, you would know this didn't start a month ago. This happened 75 years way back during the Nakba. This has been a struggle for 75 years, but now that this scale of death has become so high, now it is a topic that unfortunately we're talking about after the damage is done. So if we don't know any better, we're going to be taught a warped history of history, a warped version of history that has us siding with the oppressors, just like what happened in Indonesia with East Timor, where education was militarized. And if you didn't know any better, you would assume that was your reality, but you have to look past it.
So thinking about Palestine and colonization of the mind, this is not just a new conflict. In fact, it's not even a conflict. It's 75 years of colonization and apartheid that started with the Nakba of 1948. To refresh your memory, that was the mass displacement of Palestinians from their homes, where 700,000 people were forced out of their homes by the Zionists during the Zionist movement. Once again, to emphasize, this is not a conflict, it's an occupation and a genocide. And the fact that most people do not know that is colonization of the mind itself. And then we have internal bias against the Arab world. There's this internal bias against the Middle East. It's often ignored because it's far or thought of as unimportant or just not cared for at all. And this is a very Eurocentric way to think when you don't care for people when they're not white. And I feel like this quote really sums up that situation. It says, do you condemn the murder of children, or is it complicated when it's Middle Eastern children? Not just children, but people in general. Like, why is it when it's Arabs or when it's any non-minority or non-white minority group that people just turn a blind eye? And then there's the use of certain language, such as conflict versus occupation. The use of euphemisms is just another way we colonize the mind, because language itself paints a certain narrative. And then we have Israel's propaganda infiltrating US media. At the beginning of this, people were very quick to believe any statement Israel made, whereas the Palestinians had to constantly prove that they were dying in order to get any support. And then there's the constant use of Hamas as justification for Israel's crimes. But you can't use Hamas as an excuse to bomb hospitals, schools, camps, because you're going to say, oh, Hamas could be hiding in there. The analogy of this would be if you were to go bomb an entire school because there's a school shooter in there. You can't just sacrifice everyone. And I hope people can see beyond like the do you condemn Hamas notion, because it's so much more nuanced than just Hamas. And then there's the desensitization of violence against children, or just people. Once again, what this means is people are basically starting to think of death tolls as just a number, but every death is another life, and you cannot become desensitized to that. You can't think of a number as just a number when genocide is happening. Each number is another life. It could be another child, and to ignore any life is just unjust. But slowly, the world is starting to see the true narrative. Once again, like this first started off with people believing that Hamas had beheaded 40 babies, also proven to be false, but people started to shift their views and really think for themselves and see with their own eyes what was happening on social media, which is decolonization of the mind happening in real time. And then there was worldwide boycotts of Starbucks. As of yesterday, Starbucks has lost $11 billion in revenue, which is a lot of money and shows that the boycotts are working. And finally, people of all different origins, especially those with origins in the global south, such as indigenous people, South American, Southeast Asia, even with Jewish Voice for Peace, people are coming together to urge for ceasefire and have shown worldwide solidarity with the people of Palestine. So the West always sees through things through an American lens. So what we've done here is put the number of Palestinian casualties in respect to what it would be in America, so you can really see that correlation. You see a number like 20,000 dead, and that's a big number, that's really bad, but I don't think people really understand the severity of that, because you don't realize that some countries and regions are incredibly small in comparison to our country, so the level of destruction is really catastrophic in comparison to their total population. So basically this would be 2.4 million Americans killed, 6.3 million Americans wounded, 64.8 million homes destroyed, and 284 million Americans displaced. If you look at the total population of the US, that's 365 million people. So that's 80% of Americans displaced, and that's what happened in Palestine. 80% of the population was displaced.
Okay, so this is a quote, which ties into my next slide. So it's what colonialism does is cause an identity crisis about one's own culture. And so, yeah, so that really ties well into the idea of the colonial mentality, which is a major theme in decolonization of the mind. So a colonial mentality is the internalized attitude of ethnic or cultural inferiority felt by people who are colonized, and it corresponds with the belief that the culture of the colonizer is inherently superior to one's own. So specifically concerning the Philippines, there have been studies done on how Filipinos feel the colonial mentality, and based on that, there are 5 symptoms of colonial mentality that are found. So they are feeling of inferiority for being Filipino, feelings of shame, embarrassment, resentment, or self-hate about being a person of Filipino heritage, their denigration of the Filipino body in respect to regarding white physical characteristics as more attractive, advantageous, and desirable than typical Filipino traits, which are like brown skin and a flat nose. Then there's discrimination against less westernized Filipinos. So people from the provinces or indigenous people, and calling those people backward for not being as advanced as westernized Filipinos. And finally, it's tolerating or minimizing historical and contemporary oppression of Filipinos, because this oppression is accepted as the cost of civilization, of becoming like the oppressors. And so a good way that people in the Philippines have been able to decolonize their minds is through Decolonizing Filipino, which is it's defined as the philosophical school or and psychology rooted in the experiences, ideas, and culture of the Philippines, of Filipinos. So this movement has 3 main areas of protest. One is against the colonial mentality and for decolonization of the mind. Second is against the imposition of a psychology that's more appropriate for industrialized countries, and third is against exploitation of the masses through psychology. So, okay, so because this is about India, colonization of mind, and because I spent 10 years in India and I have a lot of personal experience with that, all of this is based off of what I've personally seen. So this is this is very personal to me specifically. So first is Western beauty standards, and this is very similar to one of the symptoms I said for Filipinos, where people in India it's just such a norm that your skin has to be as light and as fair as possible. It's such a normal thing to go into stores and see skin lightening and skin whitening creams. People bleach their skin. It's just such a norm at this point. Like, you can very easily say that someone's attractive or unattractive because of how dark their skin is. So, which is of course a Western standard. Like, it's not inherently a thing in India. It's just been imposed onto us, and we've all just started to accept that culturally. Second is criticizing arranged marriage based on Western ideals. So a thing that I see a lot, both by people from the West and the younger generation of Indians, like people who are becoming more Westernized, is that they start to equate arranged marriage to forced marriage, which is just inherently not true, because of course there is a lot of arranged marriage that's coercive, and it's used as like a tactic for misogyny and to control, people in their family. And so, of course, there is a lot of history of that not being a good thing. But arranged marriage is not inherently a bad thing. They've done studies, and they've seen that people in arranged marriages can be, or have been found to have more satisfaction in their relationships than people who just fell in love and got married. And oftentimes in India, arranged marriage there's so much consent in that process between the bride and the groom, like picking who they want to get married. So it's not always a bad thing. If you think it's a bad thing, that's just very inherent to colonization of the mind. And finally is English as the primary medium of instruction in education. So I've seen a lot that most of the bigger schools in India, their only main instruction is English and not any of the native languages that people use. Those are more, schools that have other languages as their main instruction, or more commonly like much smaller schools that are in villages, or just not seen as very advanced. And you're only allowed, and you're told you're not allowed to speak anything but English in that school, except for when you're in a second language class, which inherently is kind of ridiculous too. Because a lot of Indians, their first language is their native language, but the school frames as English is your first language, and whatever other language you know, that's the second language. So it's like if you're in school for 8 hours a day, 7.5 hours you have to speak English, 20 minutes you can speak the language you were born up. You speak in your family. So and then to talk about decolonization of the mind, first is that first example is actually a great example of the government supporting decolonization of the mind on a wide scale. So just for context, most of the states in India were their names were made by the Britishers, like when they were colonizing us. So from like the 1990s to the 2010s, the Indian government has been changing these state names to like erase the Anglicization. So some examples are Calcutta is now Kolkata, Bombay is now Mumbai, Bangalore is Bangalore. So you can just see that they're just trying to get rid of the influence and like truly think of India as a place of Indians, not a place that was just named by Britishers. And another way that we decolonize our minds is through multilingualism. So like how I said that in schools you're told like they act like English is like the only language you're supposed to speak and the most important one. So they kind of impose that system onto us. But a lot of Indian students don't take that in. They don't do that. They just, because India is just naturally a very multilingual place, so most people know at least 3 languages. So people just take English as another language in their repertoire, and they don't think of it as the only language they can use. It's just one of the ways they can, just one of the languages they can use. And finally, this is a more historical example of decolonization of the mind, and it's that you can see in the first panel, like India tries to join the the Western countries in this hyper technological state, and it's not being allowed to, and then a little while later, it's able to displace those people and show, but while maintaining what it was in the first place. It didn't have to change to become something, which shows that even though India was being seen by Western countries as overly agricultural and primitive, it doesn't have to get rid of that to take on more like Western values of being technologically advanced. Those two things can coexist at the same time, which shows that India is able to decolonize its own mind to the system that's been like pushed into it for so long.
All right, so now we're going to talk about Africa in the West. This is something Haruka and Maya's team touched on Tuesday, and I agree with all your points. One misconception here in the West is that the entire continent is in a state of poverty. I remember when I was in elementary school, and I'm sure a lot of you too do, when you were eating food and you didn't finish all of it and you would throw it away, friends would tease you and be like, oh, kids in Africa need that. So even at a young age, we knew that Africa had this sort of bias against it, that this entire continent full of so many diverse people was all in a state of poverty, when that just isn't the case. Yes, it is the poorest continent. There are a lot of countries that are experiencing poverty, but that is not the entire case for everyone. There are cities, there are rural areas, there are ways where people can still flourish and thrive. And another misconception is how Africa has a lack of technology. That's also not the case. Africa has almost all the same tech we do here. Of course, not as nothing groundbreaking, but everything we consider to be normal, they have as well. They actually even have their own conference in Morocco called GI Techs Africa. Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, all of them are countries that participate. They focus on healthcare, medicine, agricultural technology, manufacturing, cybersecurity. All of those have countries in Africa that are trying to lead the way and bring them more into the global sphere for tech. And then another misconception is that Africa has no complex history. That's also not the case. We have more documented history on Europe, just because up until the late 19th century, Africa was known as the Dark Continent, just because no other historian knew much about the kingdoms there. For example, Mansa Musa, if you guys have heard of him, he's known as the richest man in history. When he made his pilgrimage to Mecca during the 14th century, he actually broke local economies in the Middle East because of how much gold he spent there. So there is a lot of complex history in the region, a lot of agricultural and architectural feats were seen in Africa, and it's very complex. We just know Egypt mostly because of its ties with Greece, but Central and Southern Africa do have deep historical roots. But all these misconceptions do have real-world consequences. For example, our media always portrays the negative light in Africa. So in terms of Congo and Sudan, Congo, since 1996, I think has had 6 million people killed. And the population of Congo right now is 96 million. That's almost 7% of the population. So again, like Mara was talking about, 6 million is a huge number, but when we compare it to their actual population, it's catastrophic. It's huge. And also, if we just keep reporting the doom and gloom of the situation, that would be the same way if in America, we just reported all of our mass shootings, all of our corrupt politicians. If that's all anyone would know us for, then America would just be like a cesspool for violence. But we're not just known for those things. We're known for our media. Hollywood is very famous worldwide. We're known for our sports, the Super Bowl. Football is a very national thing that we take pride in. We're known for our diversity in some states. We're still moving towards it, but we are known for including more diversity in our workplaces, and you're just being the free country of the world, basically. But we don't take into account how a lot of these African countries are in such a state because of imperialist interventions. A lot of people can just brush it off as, oh, if they wanted to, they could just fix their government. They let this happen to themselves, when that's not the case. Europe and the US came in, took all their natural resources, and this country has a lot. The continent, I believe, has some of the most natural resources in the world. We took all of it and then left them destabilized, which led to the regimes taking over and a lot of factions fighting. So we just need to take a step back, and by decolonizing our mind, we understand how we got here and what we can do to go forward. We can't just paint the entire continent as lacking. And I do just want to bring your attention to this map. This is called the Mercator map. So if you see the US's size compared to Africa's, you would assume they're about roughly similar size. Africa is about like 1.2 times bigger. We're bigger than China, according to this map. We're about the same size as South America. And Greenland apparently is really huge. So this is a Mercator map. This is a misrepresentation of the globe. The poles in this map are stretched, so anything to the left is going to be expanded on. So Africa is about the right size, but everything else is made out of projection. And this wasn't made with any malicious intent. This is just the state of the map. But this was the map I was exposed to when I was younger in elementary school. I didn't figure out the true size of Africa until I was in high school when I was studying, world history in my AP classes. And that's where I thought the world was. But this is actually the true size of Africa. Excuse the cutoff. This was the only image where it wasn't pixelated. But you can see you can fit multiple US's in this map. You can fit all of China. India is right on the right. A lot of European countries as well. And you can just see the scales on the bottom. So people underestimate just how big of a continent this is. And yet we keep painting everyone in this region under a monolith. Well, that's not the case. Every single culture, every single tribe, every single country has its own customs, own outlook on the world, own connections with the land. But in media, we just paint it all as, oh, corruption everywhere. Everyone has a lack of technology. Everyone is like this. That's not the case. Our own states aren't all the same. How can this entire country and how can this entire continent not have such a diverse people and culture?
So regardless of all of the colonization that exists, it's not too late to undo, or more importantly, prevent colonization from worsening. So I have some small scale solutions. The first one I have is the importance of land acknowledgements, recognizing and respecting the indigenous people's land who we are located on. I also have supporting indigenous-owned businesses. For example, Phil's Coffee, a Palestinian-owned coffee shop over Starbucks, has everlasting impacts. Also, collaborating with people from different backgrounds. Each of us bring different experiences to the table, and collabing with people unlike ourselves can further expand our mind. And lastly, I have the importance of supporting legal advocacy, supporting legal initiatives that seek to address historical injustices, land rights, and sovereignty issues. An example of how you can do this is by contacting your local government officials. And then I also have solutions for how to help out UCSD specifically. First off, I have promoting cultural exchange programs. I don't know if you guys know this, but on the second floor of the Price Center, we have the Cross Culture Exchange Center, and it's basically students that rally together to help break the barrier between indigenous and non-indigenous groups. And then I also have to support indigenous artists. You can go to the UCSD museums and express care for indigenous artwork. One example I have is the Chicano Legacy mural painted by the Peterson Hall, painted by Mario Torrero, a San Diego activist and artist. And then something we can all do is decolonize education, advocate for diverse and inclusive curriculum. And then also I have to join diverse student organizations, and on campus we have a lot of clubs of all different backgrounds, and surrounding yourself with people from your community could help decolonize. And then something I really wanted to talk about is the importance of your media advocacy. A lot of people say that be careful what you post on social media because it stays there forever and that you have to be very cautious, but I think we all need to realize the impact that holds. So there's a lot of things that you can post that literally take 2 seconds, but it reminds those around you, and it reaches such a high audience to remind people to decolonize. So I have some examples of simple things that you can post. The first one is actually something that my little sister posted. She's literally 14, but it says, "My name is Maria and I proudly stand in the unwavering solidarity with Palestine." There's an account that makes these flyers with literally hundreds of names in different languages, and you can request your name to be posted. My name is like currently being in the request, but yeah, it takes like 2 seconds to post. I also have the ocean is responsible for every second breath we take. And then another thing I think is unique is this Peace in Palestine and Freedom shirt. And then lastly, I have End Settler Colonialism, Stop Invisibilizing Genocide. All 4 of these things, like I said, take a small second to post, but they go a very long way. And then lastly, I have some large-scale solutions that I think are important to embed in society, but it's important to keep in mind that these large-scale solutions will only happen if we start personally decolonizing. So I have amending immigration policies. I think it's very important in our country to review and amend immigration policies and respect the right for people to be able to migrate. Some other things are cultural heritage protection, healthcare equity, and international cooperation. As global citizens, it's important that we work on building off each other instead of tearing each other apart. And then something that's very important to me is encouraging and supporting the participation of indigenous people in political, economic, and social rules, as we all need to be properly represented. And then in an effort to maximize our impact on you all, we created a resources document page. So if anyone wants to scan the QR code, there are links to donation pages and further information on decolonization.
Thank you for such a brilliant, inspiring presentation. We have time for questions and answers, comments.
I just had like an interesting comment that I did think it was pretty interesting that you guys decided to translate the atrocities of Palestinian genocide into, say, like American statistical terms. And I think that was an interesting idea because I think it did help me put it into perspective more, but it also made me think that along the idea of decolonizing your mind, we also need to kind of de-Americanize our minds and stop thinking about the world just in terms of America and just see other countries for what they are, not just as, oh, this is like an American version of like this many people. Like we should just see it as what it is. It's a pretty interesting idea.
Exactly, yeah, and that's a sad reality. It's not for everyone in this class because the majority of us are educated and we know about these topics, but the majority of the public, of course, when they hear like 2,000, 10,000 dead, yeah, they'll pray about it. It's a sad life, but they don't like know the scope. We like, for some reason in the U.S., our culture is very individualistic. We don't really care for other countries. I've talked to some people and their whole mentality, they were born here, raised here. All they care about is the U.S. and they think they're better than everyone else because they just happen to be born right here and with a good upper class family. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting too because the U.S., like, yes, the people only care about people in the U.S., but I would argue that even people in the U.S. don't even care about other people in the U.S. Especially because if you consider like the global South is not a place, but like people here are obviously are in the global South. Like, I would say that there's such a discrepancy in the way that we treat one another, like compared to other people in the world. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, it's even made worse because of it's becoming harder to live now. So before, like it wasn't that good back then, but at least we had like a small sense of community. Now because everything's so expensive, people have just been fending for themselves. I think now it's like worse than ever. Hopefully we'll get better, but it just depends on this next election, what happens, state of the world, all that.
I was just to like add on to that, I think a lot of that is because the U.S. and like what a lot of Western countries have this very like individualistic values of like, oh, you need to work for yourself and you matter more than your community. It's you and your family. But a lot of Eastern countries, they're very collectivist. They think of community first. They think of what can I do for my community, and they think of themselves as like existing as someone in that community. But we think of Americans think of themselves, and I guess we do too, as I am me, and me being American is like second. I'm part of America, sure, I'm part of my community, but I am me first, and my endeavors matter more than everyone else's. So a lot of it is like very ingrained into our culture, so it's kind of, in that way it is kind of hard to say that like, we can all just easily decolonize our minds, because it's been pushed down our throats for so long. It's ingrained in our education and in the way that parents teach their children to value themselves more than other people.
So about your India piece, I thought it was interesting because I know like changing the names of like places is like super important for decolonizing, but I remember like for Japan at least, like when we talk about like World War II, and that was like pretty like, I think 1940s, 1950s type thing. So it's been a while, and like the younger generation doesn't really understand the scale of what happened. So I think it's important to decolonize the mind, but also like keep the conversation around colonialism happening so that we can sort of understand what happened in history so we don't repeat what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I think that with the government doing that, I think I said they're trying to erase Anglicization, but they weren't trying to erase the history, because a lot of people still think of those places, they might use the new name, they might use the old name, because that's the name that's been around for way longer. The new name is still a new thing. But I think a lot of it is just trying to show that the government's like, they finally want to like stand up to these ideas. They don't want them to like linger in our society. And I think a lot of that kind of, I think, maybe not recently, it was like a few months ago, there's a whole thing in like this summit where the Prime Minister called India Bharat, and the internet like was like going insane, and they were like, oh my god, it's changing the name of the country, and everyone was going insane about it. And it was really weird, because Bharat is just, it's just like the Hindi word for India. It's like how people in Japan don't call it Japan, they call it like Nippon, and people in Germany don't call it Germany. It's just like that, and it's in our constitution. It's like India also called Bharat. Like, it's not a big deal. To us, that's the same thing, kind of. But to the rest of the world, they see us just as India, which in a way is also, that was derived from the Britishers calling us India. We didn't call it India at first. That's because it was So, yeah, I think it's definitely a road we still have to do a lot of work on, but it's definitely happening.
And then just to touch on that conversation we had about decolonization, another thing that plays a part in it is our news especially, but a specific part of our news. For example, you know how after we have like a big event like Congress News and World News, then we have like a small section of like local events, like local boy wins spelling bee, or this one person does a nice act for someone else. So we have some touch of humanization in our news, along with like the depressing stuff. But I don't recall ever seeing like any human news in Africa or Iraq or India. It's mostly just U.S. and U.S. and Europe especially. That's where all the feel-good stories are. But then all the depressing news you're gonna get from the global South. So it's kind of hard for people to, which is sad, but it's hard for people to relate to them, because here we need to relate to someone to care about them in our culture for some reason. But there's not a very human side whenever we report on these news, and it contributes to the way we view other countries.
Well, we're running out of time. I just want to say a few things before you all run off. One is thank you so much for such a powerful and inspiring presentation. You had a really great stance. Just to remind you all too that the UCSD library is part of the problem. When I first came here last year to teach Global South, I couldn't find any of the books that I wanted to use, and I was so outraged and shocked, and I thought, what the hell kind of library is this? And then say, well, you know, we have the UC system, you can borrow it from UC Berkeley. And I said, okay, just help me find them, because you can't possibly have a so-called top 3 university when we don't even have these books. But that's the state of our situation. So when you're thinking about, like, why is the history of Europe so central, that's because the professors first came, founded it, all the books, I mean, it is the infrastructure. And then you can imagine them telling students to go to therapy. How do you go to therapy for colonialism and settler, you know, occupation? It's like such a big disconnect. That's how bad things are. But anyway, for those of you who wanted to give more comments and feedback, we can put it in discussions in Canvas, because this is our last day. I hope you all stay in touch. There's some tweets in there that I brought. And I hope that you continue to decolonize our minds beyond this class, and to take everything we've done this quarter beyond the classroom. And to stay in touch with each other. So thank you so much. Please grab some food and treats on your way out.
And then, is this someone's Apple Pencil? It was up here.
But I need the,
It's like the staff. Oh, is it really hard? No problem. Like,
I swear I lost my Apple Pencil.
Oh, this yours?
oh no! I didn't think it was still, oh my god.
You bought another one before you left it?
I didn't realize I left it in class. I thought I left it in.
This is up here the entire time?
Oh my god. That means it's been here since like. When did we present?
Last Thursday.
It's been here since last
No one picked it
Thursday.
up?
No, I think it's
Yeah. Nobody.
I did not. Dang, I did not.
I didn't really think my god. I'm gonna cry right now.
You have the receipt?
Yeah, I can. I got it from Target, but
Oh,
I'm gonna just cry. Yeah.
Dude,
what's that?
I guess it's good to try to
What's
like
that?
the personal like stories as well as the
I think I would like it better than the I made it like I like it not too sweet.
even like
I do like it.
universities teach in English, so like there's so many like similarities between
Good topic.
Is it good?
It's insane how much like there's so much diversity, but we're all so
Sorry, I'm so
similar.
sorry.
That's okay. I just didn't know.
It's like, why do we all have to have the same
You don't understand. When I had